Hi there. Welcome back to another Tuesday's Tips. I'm Greg Kaiser, and in this weekly feature, I try to simplify image editing as best I can, and personally, I use Lightroom. Most everything that I talk about is going to translate to the different image editors that are out there, so no matter what you use, how the different tools are used are going to probably apply to you. And we've covered a lot of the information off of the basic panel, some cropping information, things to get you started with a photo, and I've decided to kind of stick with that. This week is going to be a little more involved, I think, than previous weeks. We'll see how it turns out. I've been putting this one off for a little while because it is a little bit more complex to fundamentally understand, and this is where I see most of the errors coming from in image editing. Everything that we talk about is more or less you season to taste. You do it the way that you think looks right, that fits your view of the image. And I don't want to get away from that and stick with that in your own editing. But there are different ways of going about a lot of things when it comes to presence in an image. We've kind of hit on contrast a little bit, and there's different types of contrast out there. There's that contrast slider that basically will spread tones out on the histogram or bring them in to the midtones. And that's the heavy-handed way of doing contrast. There is a tone curve where you can decide where along that line, where along that bell curve you want the contrast to come in. And then there's the presence sliders. And for those that don't know what I'm talking about, we're talking about the clarity, texture, and dehaze. Now, each one of those deals with contrast, but they do it in different ways. I'm going to do my best to explain the difference between how they handle the contrast and show the way that you can most accurately use them, at least in my opinion. And everybody's image editing is going to be different, but you do need to understand that there is a difference in how these work. So I want to go ahead and get started, and we're going to go ahead and look at Lightroom, and we should have that up on the screen now, unless I hit a wrong button somewhere, which is known to happen. But this is the photo that we're going to be looking at. This is the raw, straight out of camera. It's a view from Blue Ridge Parkway here in North Carolina. I chose this picture not because it is a stellar image by any stretch. It's one that I'm happy with, but it's got great examples of when and how to use the different sliders that I'm talking about. And over here on this right side panel, under the basic tab, we have this called presence. And this is what we're talking about. Texture, clarity, and dehaze. Vibrance and saturation, I'm going to do that another day and another way. But what we're looking at are these three sliders. And unlike in previous times when I've gone from a raw image and shown the sliders, I'm going to do it a little bit different this time, and we're actually going to go kind of mid-edit. But I do want to show you what we end up with, just so you know what the direction is. This is how I visualize the scene. This is after my edit. This is everything done, and I'm happy with how it turned out. Obviously, it's a fall image. We got the colors to come in. The sky is filled in with some interest. The bridge itself has a lot of texture. And these are the things that I wanted to bring out in the edit. And again, the comparison, that's the raw capture, very flat image, not a lot of contrast in it. It does have a fairly high dynamic range with that bright sky. And there was filters involved. I had a grad filter, polarizer, and that just kind of helped get the tones to where I could do this in one shot. But then I did the edit and ended up here. So I've made a virtual copy, which is a real handy thing that you can do. And you would just right click on the image and go up and let's see, right here, create virtual copy. And when you click that, Lightroom will think for a second, and it's going to come up with the exact same image done the exact same way, but it's going to show copy here on the file name down here in the lower left. So this way I'm not doing anything different with my edit. I'm not changing that because I consider that a master file at this point. We are going to deal with this, and what I've done, I've gone in and removed anything dealing with texture, clarity, and dehaze. As you saw on the other one, texture was bumped up a little bit. On this panel, clarity was still at 0, but I did apply clarity. I did that locally, and that's going to be for another day as far as local adjustments and how to do the masks, and we'll talk about that later. But for right now, I've removed any evidence of texture, clarity, and dehaze from this image. Everything else is still there, so we still have the colors, we still have the overall contrast, we still have the sky where I want it. All the local edits are there. I've just removed the texture, clarity, and dehaze. And I actually did not use dehaze in this one. It's one I very rarely use, and I'm going to get to that in a minute. But we need to look at what these sliders do. And the easiest thing to do is to go over and just play with them. So if I was to reduce the texture, you see how it gives kind of this weird blur to it? And I've seen some photographers do this effect trying to get a fake lens blur using wide aperture and that sort of thing. It's not a great way of doing it. I very rarely will reduce or even increase texture 100% either way, but that's one end of the spectrum. That is in the middle, and then if we were to increase texture, you see how that brings out all of this detail in the trees and in the grass, and it becomes almost too much. But between here and here, we learn what it is dealing with. Texture deals with high frequency contrast and textures. And what I mean by that is these areas like grass, where you have a lot of fine detail, very, very just delicate textures and detail here in the grass. As we increase texture, you see that it kind of makes that pop and makes it a little bit clearer. That's what we're looking at. And the same thing goes with trees, especially at a distance, because you get really small detail here in the trees with the leaves. So as you do the texture slider, you see how it softens those edges. When I bring it back up, it makes those edges pop. And you go to where you feel comfortable. And a lot of times with texture, I will do this globally because most of what I shoot has this fine detail throughout, whether it's grass, leaves, wood, rusted metal, something like that. That is where this turns into a really good tool. It also will not really affect the sky unless you've got a lot of detail in the clouds. This particular sky is all very soft. There is no high frequency texture up there. So if we look at the sky, and we can just see how this goes, as we're adjusting the texture, there's not a lot that comes into play. And if it's more than what you want to see, then do a local mask, and then you won't have to worry about the sky. Where I ended up, and I believe it was plus 23, there's no problem in the sky at all. So I didn't worry about doing a mask for that. I left it as a global edit for texture. So remember, texture is dealing with high frequency textures and contrast. Trees at a distance, grass, weeds, anything like that that you want to kind of add a little bit of edge pop to. That's what texture does. I'm going to zero that out because I'm going to do all of these globally so you see what it does to different things. And I'll go ahead and go to the stone before we move off of texture. See, it gives just a little bit of change in some of the areas. And if you look here on this part, right along in this section, you see some fine detail. But most of this is not fine detail. But there's enough there to where the texture does make a difference. It makes it pop just a little bit. And that's where we ended up with at plus 23. And you see we've got some nice detail here in these fine areas, and that's that high frequency texture. So that's how texture works. Moving to clarity, and this is one that I see a lot of times, and we start to see those crunchy pictures. Sometimes that's good, sometimes it's bad. When I'm dealing with rust, I like a little bit of crunch. I like that texture to be very, very contrasty. I like to be able to see that texture and really feel like I can feel it. I don't like it in landscapes because what we see here, and again, let's play with the slider, and this is global, this is affecting everything. If we were to boost the clarity up to 100, it really starts to make this look bad, in my opinion. I mean, you've got a lot of edge detail, you've got a lot of highlights, there's a bunch going on here, and you may not want it that much, and you may like it somewhere middle of the road in the 50s. I still don't care for that, but to each his own. The other end of the spectrum, if we take the clarity down, you can kind of see where the colors are almost starting to bleed over into each other, and everything gets very soft. It's not a blur, but it is a lack of contrast, and this is one of those mid-range contrast adjustments. So what it does, it defines a lot of edges. So anywhere there is a light and dark tone present in those midtones, it will kind of spread those out, so the darks get darker, the lights get lighter. And if you look, as I'm boosting this clarity, it tends to brighten things. So I like to look at it as it is affecting those mid-tone contrasts while pushing the histogram from the midtones here. It emphasizes the brighter parts, so it starts spreading to the right as you look up here on the histogram. Watch what it does as I move the clarity. See, as I go to the left, things come into the midtones, but the highlights and brights shift the most. As we bring it up, you see the highlights and brights are starting to come up, and it really stretches that histogram to the right. So you're going to see brightening if you overdo the clarity. Some situations that's okay. Most of the time you don't really want to brighten the image with clarity because it just makes it too crunchy, too much mid-tone contrast. But let's look at what happens. So if we go down here to the grass, and remember I removed the texture slider, so we're now down to 0 as far as presence on everything. As I move the clarity up, it's not doing the same thing to the grass that texture did. All it's doing is kind of brightening the highlights. That's not what I want. Just for comparison, as we move the texture up, it doesn't change the exposure any, but it gives a little more edge clarity and cut to those fine areas of texture. So we know what clarity does with grass now. It just brightens it. It doesn't do a whole lot. But if we reduce the clarity, it softens it quite a bit and almost makes it muddy. Let's go up here to the asphalt. As we increase the clarity, it's given a little bit of contrast, but it's doing more brightening than anything. If we reduce it, it just makes the road muddy. Let's go up to the trees, because we saw what the texture did to the trees. So if we were to do the clarity here, it doesn't look terrible, but again, it gives too much contrast and starts to brighten the highlights in the leaves, too much for my taste. So I don't want clarity here. Bring that back to 0. If we go up to the sky, again, there's no real edges up in the sky. So if we add clarity, you see how it's deepening the darks here, and it's kind of making that white pop out? It gives it a very unnatural look. See, it softens that contrast. You can even do lower clarity in the sky. But if you do this globally, it affects everything. So the grass, the road, the leaves, the sky, clarity is not really working. It's not a tool that I would use in those areas, but it is a global adjustment that you can do globally if you want. I prefer to do clarity locally. And what I ended up doing was doing the clarity on the bridge. And to see what it's doing here, we'd just zoom in on the bridge. If I was to reduce the clarity, see how it just kind of muddies things up? But if I was to bring it up just a little bit, and right about there is where I had it, if I'm not mistaken, that's just plus 18. It just gives that little bit of emphasis here, and this is on the lower frequency textures, meaning these areas that are a little bit bigger. Because if we look at the texture on there, see which ones are being affected. It's the differences between this dark area, this brighter area, this brighter area, this darker area. But if you want to go in and get the very, very fine detail within, that's going to be the texture. So in this situation, it was a combination of texture and clarity that got the look in the bricks that I wanted. And these sliders can all be used in conjunction with each other. Just know that texture is dealing with these little small, bits of texture that you can feel. Clarity starts defining the light and dark tones within. That can be shadow highlight detail, or it can be color within. So clarity works for the bridge, in my opinion. And one of the easiest things you can do when you are starting an edit, you can go through, you can pull the texture slider up, and you can say, okay, do I like this overall, or do I want to do this as a local edit? As I mentioned, I liked the texture overall, and I didn't use a whole lot. It was somewhere around here, I think, 23-ish. It was somewhere around there. And it worked in the leaves, it worked on the grass, the road wasn't really affected, the sky wasn't affected, the bricks showed some benefit from it. So I kept that globally. It didn't bother me, and I didn't need to reduce any of the effect anywhere in the scene. Clarity, I looked to see what I liked. I liked what it did with the bridge and the stonework, but I didn't like what it did with everything else, which is why I did this locally. So think about those things and think about those local adjustments. We're going to zero these back out again. Now let's talk about dehaze. This is the third way that we can introduce contrast into our photos. This is one that I see overused way too often, and it's usually in the wrong direction. Dehaze is pretty much what it sounds like it does. If there is haze or fog in an image, if you are shooting a distance scene and the atmospheric haze is starting to cut through the detail or cut into the detail, you can use dehaze and increase it to cut through that lack of contrast. This is not a good example of that because there is no fog this day. But you can see it going in the opposite direction. And this is where I actually like dehaze because it will show distance and help show depth. You can add a little bit of a haze, which is reducing contrast by dropping the dehaze slider. Now, as I mentioned with clarity, it will brighten an image. Dehaze, when applied positively, is going to darken an image. Look at the histogram. Anytime you want to know what's going on in the picture, look up here at this histogram. When it's zeroed out, this is what we've got. As I increase the dehaze amount, removing any haze in the picture, we're adding the darker tones in. We're removing lighter tones. You're removing the fog, you're making things have more definition. It is a form of contrast. But as we increase, you see what it does to the sky. And this is what a lot of folks will do when it comes to sunrises and sunset. They'll apply a whole lot of dehaze, which gives contrast, and contrast will beget saturation. So they're thinking, oh wow, this sky looks great, it's all saturated, there's extra contrast in it, all I needed to do was the dehaze slider. But it will start to introduce really weird colors. And we'll take it to the extreme. The blues go almost black. There's no longer a gradation here. The whites still are about where they are. You get kind of some greens over here, some purples over here. Dehaze does weird things with color when it's overused. And it's one that I would suggest using very sparingly. The way that I usually will use it is in a landscape or something that has a lot of distance, and I want to show a little bit more of that difference, and I'll reduce the dehaze. And I'll usually do it locally with a radial tool, and we'll get to that another day. But if we go all the way back over here, that's a very unnatural foggy look, but that shows you what the dehaze tool is capable of doing. And when it's all the way to the left, it pushes the blacks and the dark shadows into the midtones, which then pushes everything over into the highlights. As we go the other way, you see what it's doing to the histogram. This is another one of those hammers. And except for very few specific circumstances, this is not one to use globally. This is one to use locally. It is not dealing with high frequency or low frequency contrast. It is dealing with basically having the edges cut through something in terms of haze, a whitening, a fog. Like if you take your lens and you blow on it, that fog that comes over, think of when that evaporates, that's your dehaze. So this is one that you really need to kind of stay away from unless there's a specific reason. Now it does work really well in black and white because black and white is all about the contrast. And it is another contrast tool. But generally speaking, and like I said, on this particular photograph, I did not use any dehaze at all. But generally speaking, if you do dehaze, you're going to want to do it locally, either as a sky adjustment, and I would even recommend sky with a linear gradient so you're not getting down here into the edges, just kind of up around in here. This particular sky didn't need it. It already had plenty of texture, plenty of contrast for what I wanted. I liked that soft look that matched with the bridge here. But there are times that I want a little more definition to the sky, and dehaze is a good tool to use as long as you know that increasing the contrast increases the saturation and will start to shift the hue of colors. So if you're doing dehaze, know that you're going to need to do some correction on color to make the dehaze fully make sense. And again, just to show you where we're at, this is the final edit. The texture I did globally at 23. The bridge itself was handled locally, and that's going up here to the mask button, and that brings up the masks, and this is all the different masks that I've done. And as what I do, I will go through and I will name them, so it's real easy to know what I did and how I did it. This is the bridge. You can see the white part, which is what is being affected. It's titled bridge. We click on it. I actually brought the exposure up just a hair, not even a tenth of a stop. I brought the highlights down because remember, clarity is going to increase those highlights. So when I did the clarity adjustment, because globally I liked clarity on the bridge, but I didn't like it on anything else. So that's why I did this. I came in, I boosted the clarity to 19. Very subtle change in the clarity, but because of that, I needed to adjust the highlights because it pushed the highlights more than what I wanted. So we can do all of these same adjustments in these local masks, and we're going to talk about that at another time, but I wanted to show you where I came about doing it. If you start to go overboard on any one of these sliders, it's going to show, and your photograph is going to start to fall apart. So our goal is to do things gradually to end up with a big substantial change. And looking at this is what we started out with as a raw capture. This is after the edits. They were all subtle changes, but they made a big end result. So I hope you've enjoyed this week, and I know it got a little long, a little involved, and it is not the easiest thing in the world to explain the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders. There's more to it, and there's more examples that I could show on how to use, but I liked the picture that we talked about for showing the different ways that this can be used and how not to use it. If you have any suggestions for future Tuesday's tips, let me know. Drop the ideas in the comments. Don't forget, like, subscribe. It does help the channel out. I'm a very small channel at this point and probably will remain that way. But it does help, push me to do more content, and hopefully this is something that's benefiting you. So thank you for joining me. If you want to do some more in-depth mentorships, I do offer those, and I'll leave a link to those down in the comments. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.